Hello and welcome to this week's lecture on measuring inflation. This week we're going to be examining how the economists measure changes in the general overall price level in the economy. So our first question, what is inflation? Inflation refers to the increase in the overall level of prices in an economy. So when we talk about an inflation rate, we're looking at what percentage do prices go up by on average over a course of a year. In any particular year, some prices will rise and some prices will fall. Over time, we've seen the price of housing, for instance, rise, the price of gas rise, while the price of consumer electronics, for instance, usually falls, and some other things fall over time. So what a measure of inflation tries to do is to seek how the cost of living has changed over time, to see what's happened to the overall level of prices, including both those that are rising and those that are falling. Some common measures of inflation are the consumer price index and the GDP deflator. The GDP deflator, you'll recall, we talked about in the previous chapter when we talked about moving from measures of nominal GDP to real GDP. The consumer price index is something that looks at the cost of a fixed basket of goods that consumers consume over time and tries to identify how the price of that basket has changed over time. This is somewhat different than the GDP deflator, which looks at the things that we produce in the economy, whether they're consumed domestically or consumed abroad, the things that we produce domestically, and asks how much would those things sell for in previous years versus the current year. We'll note that over time, we see that prices have risen. Inflation has generally been a positive number. If you look at the top graph over on the right, this maps the change in the level of prices. That is, how much is the cost of the bundle risen over time. In the bottom graph, what we look at is the percentage change from one year to the next. And what you can see if you look at the graph is that the line steadily drifts upward, and there's a relatively large, a relatively steep increase in the line in the 1970s. Inflation was very high in the 1970s. You can see that by the steepness of the graph in the top picture. You can see that in the bottom graph, you can see how high the line has gone. I've charted both common measures of inflation in the two pictures. The blue line in each graph represents the increase in the consumer price index. The red line represents increases in the GDP deflator. We've had, you can tell from the graphs, very high inflation in the 1970s, but since the 1981-82 recession, inflation has been much lower. It's been, historically, it's been under 5%, or, except for a very brief blip around 1990. It's been under 5% for over the last 30 years. We would note also, if you look at the two graphs, that the red line rises somewhat more slowly and has been much more stable. It doesn't bounce around quite as much as the blue line. And I want you to start thinking about why that might be the case, and we'll talk about that in a few more slides. But first, what we're going to do is explain how to compute the CPI, and later we'll take a look at how to compute the GDP deflator, and then we'll compare and contrast those two things to see which gives us, or what kinds of things we can do to get a good measure of the cost of living. Okay, so our next task is to consider how to calculate the consumer price index. The first step is to decide on the basket of goods, a basket of goods that's representative of the average consumer's purchasing habits. And the CPI in practice uses over 20,000 different goods, from breakfast cereal to toothbrushes to vehicles to apartments and all sorts of things like that, to calculate the index. And they examine how the prices of these goods change over time. The first task is to find the prices of all of the goods in the bundle right now to see how much the representative consumer's bundle of goods costs, and then to compare that to a base year, to the cost of the basket in a base year. Choosing a base year is essentially saying, what are we going to use as our reference year? What are we going to use as our comparison year? In practice, the CPI uses the bundle of goods from, the prices of this bundle of goods from 1982 to 1984, a weighted average of those 3 years. So what we do is we figure out the prices of all of these goods in our basket in the current year. Then we figure out the prices of each good in the base year, step 5 here, and then we compute the basket's cost in the base year, and then we calculate the index. And the index is simple ratio of the cost of the basket in the current year divided by the cost of the basket in the base year times 100. So in the base year, the cost of this bundle will be exactly 100. If in some subsequent year the index works out to be 110, what that means is that prices are 10% higher than they were in the base year, which is the period of 1982 to 1984. We'll do this again with a fairly simple example using 2 goods instead of 20,000. So, for example, suppose that our basket consists of 4 apples and 2 bananas. And we're interested in computing the consumer price index for the years 2006, 2007, and 2008. So if we look at 2008 and see that apples cost $3 and bananas costs $4, in 2007 those same prices were 2 and 3, and in 2006 those prices were 1 and 2, can we compute the index for each of those years? In 2008, our basket of 4 apples and 2 bananas costs $20. In 2007, that same basket costs $14, and in 2006, that basket costs $8. So then what we do is we choose the base year, in this case 2006, and compute the index. And the index is the ratio of the cost of the bundles in each of the years divided by the cost of that same basket in the base year. So we can see that in 2008, the basket costs $20 divided by the $8 cost in the base year, and we see that we have an index equal to 250. In other words, the price of our basket has gone up by 150% relative to the base year. In 2007, that basket cost $14 divided by the $8 cost in the base year times 100 to get our index value, and this gives us an index for 2007 of 175. In other words, on average, prices have gone up by 75% between 2006 and 2007. You can see that if we compute this for 2006, the index is going to be exactly 100. We'll have $8 divided by $8, giving us an index value of exactly 100.